Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Haiku Talk. I'm your host, Ben Ga, your friendly neighborhood haiku poet. And today we're going to be taking a look at a piece from the latest issue of Modern Haiku. That would be the autumn 2022 issue. It's the current one. From a poet named Michele Root-Bernstein. And her poem has a verse line of Winter Sunset. It's a nice, dense poem about time. So, with that said, you know what time it is. Time to grab yourself a tasty beverage. And let's all sit back, relax, and haiku. Okay, welcome back, everybody. Good to see you. Good to be with you all again today. And again, we're taking a look at a poem from the current issue of Modern Haiku from former Frog Pond editor Michele Root-Bernstein. Her poem goes like this. Winter sunset, moment by moment, the vintage flip clock. Winter sunset, moment by moment, the vintage flip clock. Really wonderful poem here. And as I said at the top of this, it's a really amazingly condensed and dense poem about the passage of time. Now, I personally am a big fan of haiku that hint at the passage of time. I've written many of them myself. One of my more well-recognized poems to myself is around time passage, which goes like this. Steeping tea, the time it takes to lose a street to snow. Steeping tea, the time it takes to lose a street to snow. Passage of time poem also takes place in winter. And like I said, I'm a big fan of these types of poems. This one, there's so many different ways to think about time in this poem. It's absolutely amazing. And this one, I think structurally you could argue that it might be fragment and phrase, with the fragment being the first line of Winter Sunset and the phrase being moment by moment, the vintage flip clock. I would also argue that you could call this a middle pivot, where both moment by moment speaks to line 1, Winter Sunset, as well as line 3, the vintage flip clock. And so for this instance, let's just call it we're going to go middle pivot this time, because we don't talk about those too often. So this is a middle pivot poem. Again, in a middle pivot means that the break or the pivot or the cut in the haiku happens with the middle line. So when we talk fragment and phrase, there is the distinction between the fragment and then the phrase. And the cut is what that would be called, sits between those two. And the poem works as a juxtaposition between the fragment and the phrase. In the context of a middle pivot structure, it's the middle line that speaks both to the two other images happening. So it is the thing that gives the other two images context. Not unlike the fragment does with the phrase, but it just does it in a different way. I'm also a big fan of middle pivot poems. So this one just lights up my brain on all sorts of levels. So let's take a look at this poem line by line and break down what's happening and all of the different ways that time is referenced in this piece, because there's quite a few of them. So it starts with the first line of Winter Sunset. Winter sunset. And already we have a couple references to time. Apart it being a beautiful image by itself, which captures your imagination and draws it in. And in fact, the winter sunset just happened right behind me here in St. Louis just moments ago. Although we're not technically in winter yet, the solstice hasn't happened. It's cold. It feels like winter. But you have That's a good line. It captures your imagination. It captures your senses. You can start to see something. But in the context of this poem being so much about time, it does a couple things. It puts it at a time of day, sunset. It also puts it in a specific season, winter. So not only do we know what time of day it is, but we also know what season it is. And both of those things together have a lot of weight to them about how you're feeling at that time of the year, what's going on in the natural world at this time of the year. And, those are a lot of good weighty things to chew on. Now, when we flip to line 2, which is moment by moment, moment by moment, this is the actual context line of the poem, because that's what we are doing as we read this poem. We're not only going through it line by line or moment by moment, but the poem is essentially about the passing moments of time that you encounter within this poem. And so it adds color to line 1 already. And then when we get to line 3, it adds more color. So line 3 is the vintage flip clock. The vintage flip clock. Now this particular line has a lot to do with time in it. First of all, it's the image of a vintage flip clock. And these are, for those of you who might not know what this is, if you're young enough, you might not have experienced one of these before, but it's an analog clock that has, for every number, has a little, basically every minute and every hour, the number changes it flips down, like it's just like this Rolodex of numbers, this flipping cards of numbers. And every time that would happen, you would hear the little flip going from one number to the next. And so moment by moment, you're constantly hearing the clock work. And so this line in particular is very, very, very densely layered. And Michele is known for her fine intricacies and details in her poems. And this is a great example of one of her poems and how she can cram so much stuff into there. And also, again, we're using simple, succinct, suggestive language to accomplish this task. And the suggestive language especially is what's allowing you to think about all of these different types of time. Because if we have vintage flip clock. So this suggests a number of things. One thing it suggests on a high level is that unlike, the first line is the winter sunset, which is the natural world, and you can measure time passing naturally without anything other than your senses. A clock is a human-made invention. It's our way of trying to segregate out how many minutes, how many hours in a day, how many months in a year, how many years, things take. And so it's on a high level, it's suggesting that, hey, there's a distinction between the natural way of telling time, of watching the sunset and feeling the seasons, to this mechanical way that humans have done it. And so that's another way of thinking about time. Then the fact that it's a vintage flip clock suggests a couple other things. So it suggests that it's an old clock, not a new clock. And because it's a vintage flip clock that tells time but also has an auditory presence of time, you know that it's analog. And it comes from a time when the counting time, all of our timepieces made noise. Whether it was a wristwatch that had the little ticks, whether it's a clock on the wall that had ticks, the little second hand ticking along, to all kinds of different clocks. I know when I was a kid going into my grandma and grandpa Gaz's house especially, they had a grandfather clock that had a big pendulum that swung and ticked, and then it would, every 15 minutes, every quarter hour you get a chime, every half hour you get a chime, and then every full hour you get the big chimes counting out the hours of the day. They also had a cuckoo clock, which had its own little pendulum, and it had its own way of cuckooing the time. And, stepping into that house was a world where you constantly heard clock ticking. And as I look around my place here now, I have no clocks that make noise. All contemporary clocks, at least, that aren't vintage. So there's a distinction between vintage clock and a new clock. All current new clocks don't make noise. They're all digital. And so you have this, not only are you talking about humans make machines to tell time, but the timepieces that we have changed over time. And we're looking at a clock from an older time in our present time. And so as you can see, all of these things, all of these ways that time is present in this poem are really, really fascinating. And I'm sure if you think about it, you can come up with probably at least a half dozen more ways of how time is present in this very, very short poem that is really, really remarkable. And whether or not you think about all of those ways that time is present in this poem, it's not really the point, because on the base level, you still get a very beautiful image of a winter sunset and the time basically passing of watching that sunset is being captured in the clicks of that vintage clock. And so you get the impression that you know that you're standing there long enough watching the sunset to be aware of time passing with that clock. And that's beautiful. That's all you need. All of those extra layers are just, it's extra icing on the cake, and makes for great haiku talk poems to talk through and think about and churn on. But when you are working and writing on your own pieces, it's good to keep things like that in mind. Like if there's a way to do what like Michele did here, is to incorporate other aspects or use good suggestive language that can enhance the poem that you have. Now, why it's a vintage flip clock, for example, and not a cuckoo clock or a grandfather clock or some other kind of ticking clock. I mean, it's a very specific thing to have used. And in this case, it adds a certain color to the poem. Not only does it give you kind of an image of what the clock might look like, but depending on how old you are, if you're probably my age or older, you have specific memories of such clocks back when you could probably buy them brand new. And that makes you feel old or young or however you want to feel about it. But it's got a nice nostalgia piece to it, even though the poem takes place in the present day. And just being aware of little elements like that can suggest, using that suggestive part of haiku language to allow the poem to stretch out in places should the reader want to go there. But if you are using that, just keep in mind that the base core experience has to be there. You don't want to get lost in the details of the poem. The core has to hold, and in this case, the core holds quite beautifully. Love this piece. Thank you, Michele. Thank you, Modern Haiku. Looking forward to the next issue next year. And thank you, dear readers, listeners, watchers of this channel, for tuning in for yet another episode. Thank you very much. It does mean a lot, and it's nice to spend some time with you. With that said, it's the last episode before the holiday here in the U.S. I'm not sure if there's going to be another one or not before the new year, but everybody have a safe and happy holidays, and we'll talk again real soon. Thanks.